was all the words I could come up with to put in there. Thank you. It's great to be here with you today to talk about grant programs. Before I get into the nuts and bolts of our couple of programs, I wanted to kind of piggyback on some of the tips you've heard to kind of reinforce and add to some of that while I'm thinking about them before they fly out of my mind. But if anybody here is a gardener, if you grow veggies or plants, flowers, anything like that, you know they have to be cultivated if you want them to grow. Grants are the same way. You've got to cultivate them, and you got to be sure that the grant or the plant fits in your garden area, your soil, your climate. You're not going to try to grow a tropical plant in a cold weather climate. So you want to be sure the grant fits with what you want to do. And I would echo too, definitely take advantage of the staff people being willing and interested in talking with you about your application long before you submit it to try and figure out if it's going to be a good match or not, to try and figure out where the red flags might be, figure out the things that might make your project successful and identify it as a good fit. And send in a draft long ahead of the deadline date as far as you can so that staff can look at it and give you back any feedback or any tips for how to make it stronger. So I think all those things are very important. Don't hesitate to do that. Some of the funders may have it. I know we have an email newsletter that we send out every month that includes all kinds of stuff about our programs and upcoming things, but also about our grants, other grants, our preservation conference, other conferences, so things like that that might be of interest to you as well. It's another way to find out about potential opportunities. All you got to do if you want to get on our email list is just, if you'll have my contact information here. You can send me an email and say, please put me on your email list, and we'll take care of that. All right, so who are we? I'm with the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. I'm a supervisor in the State Historic Preservation Office, which is a branch of the Department of Archives and History. You might know us from such things as doing research on genealogy or local history, but we also work with state government agencies on retaining their permanently important records. And then we also have the State Historic Preservation Office. Everything that we do at the State Historic Preservation Office revolves around the National Register of Historic Places, which is a federal program through the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service. But every state has a state preservation office that also works with those federal programs tied to the National Register. So everything we do, including our grant program, one way or another ties back into the National Register of Historic Places, either to help preserve properties and places and districts that are listed in the register, or try to identify properties and places and districts that may be eligible for listing in the register, and then trying to provide funding and incentives and other help to promote their preservation. In the State Historic Preservation Office, our functions, again, revolve around the National Register of Historic Places. We also try to maintain a survey and inventory of historic properties in the state. We also have a review and compliance program. If you get a CDBG grant or some other federal grant, then our office actually has a role in reviewing that with you. The federal agency is required to consult with our office about determining, identifying any effects of that federally funded undertaking, what effects they might have on National Register listed or eligible programs. So we get a chance to be involved very briefly in all those federally funded projects, including CDBG and others. So if you get federal funding for your project from any federal source, good chance you're going to get to be consulting with us at some point early on. And we also have grants and tax incentives for historic properties, and I'll talk about the two of our grant programs today. We have pass-through grants from the Federal Historic Preservation Fund, again from the National Park Service. Our office applies for a grant that we know we're going to get, which is about the best grant out there when you know you're going to get it already. But we apply for it because we're required to apply for it so that we can operate our programs and all the required functions related to the National Register. But then we're also required to sub-grant out a portion of that, and we sub-grant out as much as we're able to after we take care of our functions to local projects. So we have funds each year available out of that annual sub-grant that we get from the Park Service. And then we also have a dedicated state set of funds that I'll talk about at the end. So the federal program, again, that comes from the National Park Service. not necessarily your tax dollars, but it's actually money that comes from outer continental oil shelf oil and gas leases. Is how that generates those funds for the Historic Preservation Fund. So who is eligible to apply for these grants? Again, primarily it's two big categories. Nonprofit organizations and local governments are the ones that we work with on grants. We don't have grants for individuals, but for basically any nonprofit organization, churches even, or local government entities, those are the types of organizations that we typically work with to fund projects. Projects also have to be, we are required to fund a certain amount of projects each year in certified local government communities. Now, that could be a whole separate workshop about the certified local government program, which we can't get into today, but just trust me that even if, I've got a list of the CLGs, which I will put up here in a flash. If your community is not on it, don't fret. That doesn't mean you can't get grant funds. It's just, the CLG communities are our first priority for funding because we have an obligation to fund a certain amount of projects there. But we can and we do fund projects outside of those communities as well. These are our 35 cities and 1 county. Berkeley and Moncks Corner not on there. Doesn't mean they can't be, and also doesn't mean you can't get funding. These are just the ones that have this special designation. Again, I could do a whole workshop about, but can't today. So call me about that another time. For our federal grants, it is a match required. This is a partnership between us and the applicant, so it is a 50-50 split in costs. We do cap our contribution at $35,000, so if you apply for 35, you've got to be able to provide 35 and match, and ideally be prepared to initially pay 100% of costs up front because the grant comes to you as a reimbursement for 50% of your project expenses that we approve. That can be spread out over the life of the grant. You can do multiple draws or requests, or you can do one at the end, depending on what works for you, and we can be flexible and work with you on that. But funding is not retroactive for work that's already been accomplished prior to the grant being awarded. We do review and approve all grant-funded activities. We will work with you to help determine a scope of work that's appropriate for what you want to accomplish, but also that meets our program guidelines and requirements. We'll only reimburse you for properly documented costs, and there has to be competitive procurement of any professional services. And typically our grants are helping the applicants, usually helping them pay to hire a expert or other consultant to actually accomplish something for them. So usually those services have to be procured in a competitive fashion, depending on the budget amount. Our criteria, each grant program that you deal with is going to have some level of selection criteria and their priorities for what they're going to fund. So you want to pay attention to those no matter which program you're applying for. For our federal grant program, we focus on the projects that are most successful. In addition to having talked to us before they applied, they're ones that are well planned and have a sound methodology that is appropriate and makes sense for what it is you're trying to accomplish, that you're involving the right personnel, methodology, steps for accomplishing what you want to do. And we're also looking for projects that include resources that are significant. Properties usually have to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places or have been at least determined eligible for listing by our office, depending on the nature of the project. We're also looking to fund projects that deal with resources that may be experiencing some sort of threat to their preservation. Threat can come in a lot of different ways. It may be that it's been, lack of funding, neglect that's come from it, not having the resources to preserve it, or there may be some other outside pressure happening to it, but have to identify and determine what is the threat to the resource that might be alleviated by the funding. And we're also looking for projects that have a public benefit. Not just that it's benefiting the one historic site or the organization that we're working with, but also that project is going to have some benefit for the public, making a resource more accessible for the public, or introducing the resource to public to a resource for the first time, or in some way or other that your project has a benefit that goes beyond just the site itself. And we also want to help fund projects that are part of a larger planning process, that it's not just an isolated activity that you're doing, that it may be part of some bigger plan in the community. It might be part of a comprehensive plan or a historic resources plan, community resources plan in your community. So if you can identify and place your project in a bigger context that it might be a part of, that will help it be more competitive as well. So what type of projects do we fund? We commonly will fund historic resources. They can be as broad as countywide or citywide, or sometimes maybe thematic for a given area. But what we're trying to do is add to our statewide inventory of historic properties to record and evaluate and identify properties, see which ones might be eligible for listing in the National Register or might make sense for designation in a local preservation program. And then usually an outgrowth of those surveys, that data then is helpful for people doing projects where it might be a road widening or a cell tower or something to have identified historic properties in a given area already can help with the planning for those projects. We would also fund National Register nominations for districts or multiple properties to help increase the number of properties in South Carolina getting listed in the register that also might have some benefits for the public or their owners. We also fund projects for individual planning for historic properties. That might be if you've got a historic building, whether it's a church, library, some other historic building that you want to adapt for a new use that's compatible with the building, and you need architectural services to either, you might be on the front end of your project where you just need to assess conditions, know what you're getting into, what are you dealing with. You want to hire an architect to do an assessment to determine, all right, what's really got to be, what repairs need to be done to make this building habitable, usable for whatever purpose is. How much is that going to cost us to help you with your planning for going for other grants to help you actually accomplish these repairs. And that can be, a conditions assessment will be more on the beginning end or the low end, all the way up to, it could be bid-ready plans and specs for actual repairs that need to be done to the building. But anything where you need that architectural engineer or other planning services on a historic site, that's what the grant can help with. In limited projects with our federal money for projects that are located in the certified local government communities, we will fund stabilization to do basically weatherproofing a building, getting the exterior envelope of a building secure, keeping the weather out, stopping water infiltration on a building. We can help with those, repairing roof, repairing exterior siding, repairing windows, that sort of thing. And it does require that we have a covenant also has to be put on the building for a certain number of years and has to be listed in the National Register for sure. And we get a completion report as a record of the project at the end. All right, so that was the federal program. Briefly, I'll say, too, we've got a state-funded historic preservation program. This is a newer program for us. We just completed our very first cycle with this program. We had state funds like 20-plus years ago, and then those funds dried out for a long time, but thankfully we had another source come online for us, and we're able to have those dedicated state funds for preservation. And these are specifically for bricks and mortar weatherization projects, and they can be statewide. We are, again, focusing on awarding projects to nonprofits, churches, local governments. It can be, and really for the first cycle, we were trying to stay in rural areas that maybe had been previously underserved through our grant program before. So we're trying to encourage those projects that are maybe a little bit further out of the way, but that need the stabilization help. And these also have much larger grant awards than we can provide for the federal project. Those can be up to $200,000, and it's only a 20% match required, so it's a little more favorable match ratio for you. But again, our priorities this year were to fund rural area projects and also properties associated with underrepresented resources, particularly in the National Register, whether it's African American history or other Native history or other resources that are not as prevalent among listed properties in the National Register. Priorities are subject to change or fluctuate. We haven't announced the next round yet, but it'll probably largely be the same for 2024. And I think that's all I have got for you for our two programs. Thanks.